Hey, welcome back. So I've done a little bit more riding, and now I'm up to almost exactly 1,000 miles on this TPR 86cc build. I've looked around a bit, but I can't find anything that I would call reliable information about the service intervals of this TPR 86cc, and I found some stuff saying within 500 to 1,000 miles that entire cylinders were trashed, and I found people saying that they went a couple thousand miles and everything looked pretty good. No information in the manual from the manufacturer, etc. So I figured with 1,000 miles on it, even though I have no symptoms, it'd be a good time to just take it apart and see what's actually going on in there. Here's what the spark plug looks like. I just wanted to show you that because the weather has got colder and I haven't changed the tune. But you can see it looks like, just based on the spark plug, that it's still plenty rich because I'm washing that so clean I'm not even getting color on most of the plug, and it is wet. I'm going to do some quick squish checks just before I take it apart. I've got numbers from just after it was put together and retorqued and so on, but I just wanted to check and see real quick if the numbers are still in roughly the same spot now that it has settled in for that long. So I measured squish, top, bottom, exhaust side, and CVT side of the piston crown, just going through the spark plug hole. And you can see I range from 1.1 to 1.4 millimeters, smallest to largest clearance. And my initial measurements were 1.09 to 1.13. So essentially the same thing, maybe just a zeroing arrow of 1/100th of a millimeter on my mic or something, or my caliper. But 0.9 millimeters is what TPR recommends. I've known that this was a bit high. You can see it's about roughly 0.2 millimeters high here, and I've just gone with it. I'm not sure if I'm going to change anything at this point, but I did at least just want to see if anything had settled in anymore, if anything had changed there, and it looks like everything's still basically the same as when I put it together. The first thing I noticed here is that all of my O-rings are intact, every single one of them. And while that doesn't really matter right now because they will all be replaced, it's such a different experience than I had with my first liquid-cooled engine, which was the 103cc, and that thing would blow O-rings apart every time I took a long ride, basically. So it's nice to see with 1,000 miles on it and not being easy on it, etc., that everything is in order there. You can see clear line here from the top of the cylinder, and it doesn't really look like there has been leakage beyond the O-rings from what I can see here. Same deal looking at the top of the cylinder. I can see the lines from the O-ring where they've been contacting the top of the cylinder, but I don't see any obvious signs of leakage. You can actually see there kind of where the edge of combustion would be, ends right before that O-ring. So doesn't look like it's been leaking anywhere beyond the O-rings, which is really nice. I'm not too concerned about my crank with this kind of mileage on it, but I'll just take a quick look and I can see it doesn't appear that I have any excessive side play here. No movement this way, and it looks like the inside of my small end here, my connecting rod, is very clean. I don't have a bunch of score marks or anything like that. Don't see any signs of damage. And everything turns over very smoothly. So I don't think my bottom end here is going to be an issue. And hopefully you can see that the wrist pin bearing as well as the wrist pin itself actually look pretty good. Don't really see much sign of wear on the bearing. For the wrist pin, there's definitely some scoring happening here where it makes contact with the piston itself. A little bit of discoloration in spots, very mild, but this is so much different again than what I'm used to seeing when I pull apart the cheaper cylinder kits from builds that I've done, because normally I've got pretty extreme bluing, you know, blue-brown discoloration on here, purple, whatever, and more scoring, etc., and they don't move as freely. It's normally harder to get this out of the piston itself. So I'm actually really happy with how everything is looking here. The piston overall is looking better than I expected. I'll start with the crown, and you can see I've definitely had plenty of fuel in there. It's all washed in the areas where the flow would be from the transfers and such. And when you look at the underside, I'm not sure how well that comes out, but I really don't have much discoloration on the underside of the piston. And again, I know you're not supposed to get a bunch of discoloration and ash under here, but that's normally what I've been seeing with the air-cooled stuff. And part of it is probably just my paranoia with this kit, running it extra rich all the time. But it's just nice to see one come apart the way that they're supposed to look, rather than what it normally looks like for me with all my cheap air-cooled stuff. So that's pretty nice. In general, I'm not seeing the wear that I expected to see on this piston. I really thought I'd see a lot of scuffing and scoring, because again, that's just what I'm used to seeing, and there's really not much. You can see a few things here or there very lightly. I can't feel anything, but I can just barely see where some scores or contact has been. And when I look at the exhaust side, hopefully I can get this to come across in the video, but right here in the center, I can make out where the bridge is, but can't feel anything. There doesn't seem to be any extra wear here. Looks surprisingly good to me. I just didn't expect it to look that good, especially because it's common practice to actually drill the piston here where it aligns with the bridge of the exhaust port, and I didn't even do that, and it looks good. Like, I really thought, because this is a bridged exhaust port, from everything I've heard with these hyper race kits and such, it's just not a good idea. You're going to have too much heat in the bridge and you're going to get a lot of wear. So I didn't think the piston would look this good. I haven't checked the cylinder yet. That could be a nightmare. But the piston itself doesn't look bad at all. And also looking at the ring, don't know if that will come across very well in the video, but I don't see a bunch of scuffing. The ring looks pretty smooth. I don't see scuffing and scoring like I do a lot of times. So all of that is looking pretty good to me. Again, just based on sight, I haven't taken any measurements of anything. All I've done is wiped a rag through there just so I'm not looking at a bunch of oil residue. And at least at a glance so far, the cylinder doesn't look bad to me. You can see this spot here at the bridge, which may look like some sort of damage or wear, but that's actually not the case. The bridge was clearanced when I got this thing, so that is the same way that it looked when I got it. And I can actually still see some cross hatching in the bore there. I can see some scuffing. I'm not sure if that comes across in the camera. There is some scuffing in the cylinder. You can see the marks going up and down, but I'm talking about really light scuffing here. Nothing alarming at all to me, and it's kind of like that all the way around. This line here is really the most noticeable thing I can see in this cylinder, and that corresponds with where the gap is on the piston, where the pin is for the piston ring. And I can't feel that, nor anything else that I can find in here with a thumbnail. Everything feels surprisingly good. I was really expecting that this would be an issue from some things I've heard and just my past experience with cast iron stuff, but this is looking surprisingly good to me. I cleaned all this stuff up first with brake parts cleaner and a plastic bristled brush. I did use a brass bristled brush just on the top of this piston to get the carbon deposits off of there. And then I took it all inside and just used hot soapy water and a sponge and finished cleaning it off, and everything looks even better than it did before. There's the piston after cleaning. Not a whole lot different, but certainly the crown is nice and clean now. Even less discoloration than I noticed before. It looks pretty clean. Even though my piston ring looks pretty good as far as not being scuffed up or anything, I'm going to go ahead and check my end gap right now. So that came out to 7/1000ths of an inch, or 0.178 millimeters. Initially when I set it up, I checked it at 6/1000ths of an inch, which is 0.152 millimeters. And their spec in the manual says when you initially set it up, it should be between 0.15 and 0.35 millimeters, or 6/1000ths and 13/1000ths of an inch. So I am well within that. I mean, that would be a pretty decent spec if the thing was brand new. Even though it looks like everything is going to be fine, while it's apart, I'm going to use a micrometer as well as a dial bore gauge. And I'm going to take some measurements of my piston and my cylinder, both to determine the actual diameters of everything here and the clearances that I've got. Unfortunately, when I put this engine together, I didn't take these measurements. I would love to have those to compare right now from brand new out of the box to 1,000 miles of use. But when I was getting the engine together, it was my first experience using a high-end cylinder kit, only the second time I've ever used an aluminum cylinder kit. And I wasn't sure how bad this thing was going to be to set up, and I knew that I wanted to make a car show, and I was actually trying to make a bike show that I missed. So I just didn't want to spend the time in it, so that's why I don't have those numbers right now. But based on the amount of wear that there is on the piston ring, where it's barely worn at all as far as the end gap shows, I'm assuming these will probably be pretty close to standard. And if nothing else, maybe these will be of use in the future for reference. The first thing I want to measure is the piston's diameter. And when I measure that, what I'm going to do is measure, just like you see my fingers, basically from here to here. Basically 90 degrees off of the piston's pin axis. So I don't want to measure from here to here. I want to measure basically from on the exhaust side to the inlet side, just like this. Maybe you can see it a little better on the drawing I've made here. And I want to go just below the wrist pin, the pin bore here on the piston. Now in some cases, if you have a stock scooter or something, they may actually specify a distance from the bottom of the piston or top of the piston or something like that for exactly where you should measure. In this case, they don't give me that measurement that I'm aware of, so I'm just going to go just below the pin bore across here. There is a reason that we measure here and not up here and not at a different axis, and that is because generally these pistons are not completely round and they have a bit of a taper, usually getting larger at the bottom than they are at the top because of the way that heat is transferred into the piston and expands. So we want to measure down here, right in this specific area for that reason, because anywhere else will give you a number that is not accurate to anything else you'll find. So I'm just using a micrometer clamped into a vise. I've got wood blocks on both sides, and that's fairly gently clamped because you don't want to mess up a precision instrument. And I'm just going to use that to measure just as I explained. I measured the piston quite a few times to make sure I was correct, and I came up with 1.965 inches, or 49.91 millimeters. Next, I'm going to take some measurements of my cylinder. And if I were just looking for my piston to cylinder clearance, I wouldn't have to do all this, but I'm kind of using this as an opportunity to collect a little bit of information about this cylinder while I'm at it. So what I'm going to do, you can see I've got an X and a Y axis drawn out here. My little diagram x-axis, I'm calling the pin axis here. So going with the wrist pin, that's the x-axis, and then the y-axis will be intake to exhaust. And then I'm going to measure that in 3 different spots up and down the bore, beginning with about 10 to 15 millimeters from the deck or the top of the cylinder, then just below the port floors, the bottoms of the ports, and then just above the cutouts at the bottom of the cylinder. So this will allow me to see things like out of round and taper of the cylinder in addition to the piston to cylinder clearance. And what I'm going to do, you've seen that I've measured my piston at 1.9650 inches. So I'm just going to set up my dial bore gauge to be zeroed out on that measurement. And that way it will kind of automatically tell me what the clearance is without even having to do any math. And then I can do the math to find out what the actual dimensions of the cylinder are. I finished all my measurements and I've noted them all here on my whiteboard. So if you look at these, you can see that my clearances range from roughly 3.5 thousandths of an inch up to just over 4 thousandths of an inch. And you can average those out, the X and the Y, you can average them. But basically, that's what I'm coming up with, is roughly 3.5 thousandths to just over 4 thousandths at the worst spot for my clearances. And I've got my actual bore size written down over here, and again you can see the piston diameter here if you want that info. I won't swear that these are incredibly accurate because my the graduations on my dial bore gauge are actually in half or 5/10 thousandths. So when you see like a 3 here or an 8 there, that's basically just me saying that the needle was not exactly on the half graduation there. It's a little over, a little under, so not super precise. And I don't swear that any of my measurements are incredibly accurate, but I do the best I can. I check them multiple times to try and get them as close as possible. Zeroed out my my micrometer using a standard, etc. So anyway, that's what I came up with. I was thinking I was going to see something a lot tighter with this cylinder kit. Again, being an aluminum bore with an aluminum piston, I'm not used to those, but I thought it would probably be more like 2 thousandths or maybe up to 3 thousandths of an inch clearance was what I was kind of thinking. So now I really wish I actually did have initial specs or specs from some sort of service manual, but again, you don't generally get that kind of stuff when you've got a aftermarket kit. So anyone else that works on these aluminum high-end kits, if you want to chime in the comments and just let me know what kind of clearances you've actually measured on yours and what's kind of normal for you, by all means do that. What I did think was pretty good were my out of round and taper measurements. So the worst place I could find any out of round here, it was about 3/10 thousandths of an inch in any of these sections. And that was right here in the center, just below the port floors. I was about 3/10 thousandths of an inch out of round when you look at one versus the other, the X versus the Y. And that is much better than I'm used to seeing when I work on cast iron cylinders. So I was really happy with that. And the taper is also really good. The worst thing I could find, not even averaging them, they're just taking the smallest and largest measurements here, was 9/10 thousandths, so not even 1/1000th of an inch of taper at the very worst I could make it. So that is also much better than what I've seen in a lot of cases when I've done this with cast iron cylinders that have been used for a while. So those I'm very happy about. I'm not sure what to think of the clearance right now. Just at this second, I'm thinking everything looks pretty good. The piston ring is barely worn. I do see that my Y measurements, which would be on the thrust surfaces here, that's again the exhaust to the inlet, so where there's thrust, then those are a little larger than what I see on the X measurement of the pin axis. So I'm guessing I'm probably seeing a bit of wear on the cylinder coating, and that's where I tend to see the scuffing as well, a little bit of scuffing. Again, it's minor, but maybe I'm seeing that wear there. It's all pretty close. If you look at the bore diameters, they're not very far off, especially like the top of the bore. I believe I'm just going to go ahead and stick with this piston and this ring. Got it cleaned up, just use some new gaskets, new O-rings, etc., and probably go that way. I decided that while it's all apart, I might as well try to deal with the cylinder head and see if I can get this Squish number down closer to spec. So as you can see, there's the 0.9 millimeter recommended spec, and that's actually 0.9 millimeters plus or minus 0.1 millimeter. But I'm running roughly 0.2 millimeters over that on the low side. Again, one of my old measurements was 1.09, so somewhere about 0.2 millimeters off. I think what I'm going to do, as long as I can get this cylinder head chucked up in the lathe so it's true, I'm going to try to take off about 0.15 to 0.2 millimeters. And that'll put me pretty close to that spec. It should be within the plus or minus 0.1, but pretty near the 0.9 spec, hopefully. And here's a closer look before I cut anything. I have measured this band that goes around between the combustion chamber and the O-ring groove here, and that's about 0.45 millimeters thick. So I won't cut that totally out, and everything can remain kind of the same configuration. And also, I don't believe that cutting 0.2 millimeters out of here should ruin the O-ring seal. O-rings do have specific amounts of compression that they're designed for, but I don't believe that cutting off something like 0.15 to 0.2 millimeters should negatively affect that to the point that I'm not sealing the engine anymore. I've been messing with this thing for 30 minutes or more. Basically, got my dial indicator set up here against the surface of the head, and then I turn this around, and I can see high and low spots that way. And then when I find a spot, depending which way, I can tap it with a hammer to try and correct it. And like I said, in about half hour or more, I've got it within about 1.5 thousandths, and that seems to be as close as I can get it, but that should be fine to cut it. I set it up to take off 0.2 of a millimeter in one pass, and that's how it turned out. Looks fairly smooth, so hopefully it won't give me any trouble. Now I've just got to get the engine back together and find out where the Squish actually ended up. I've got the cylinder installed and torqued to spec, so I'm going to go ahead and check the Squish again. Here are the measurements after checking in 4 different spots, and you can see it was pretty consistent at 0.92 millimeters, aside from this one corner here at 0.90 millimeters. And that is actually dead on the spec from TPR, their recommendation, so that turned out a little better than I anticipated. I still need to do a leak or a pressure test before the engine goes back into the scooter. I think I'm going to change the gear oil, and I will probably clean up that back wheel because that thing's looking pretty nasty right now, and it's just easier to do sitting right on the workbench. But after that, it'll be ready to go back in, and I think I'm going to wrap up the video right here. For a quick summary of the first 1,000 miles with this TPR 86cc engine, as you can see in the video, everything looked pretty good when I took it apart. All the measurements were roughly on spec or where I would anticipate them to be. It never had any signs or symptoms to tell me that anything was wrong with the engine, meaning no power loss, no knocking or strange noises, nothing like that. It has ran like a top from day one. All of that has been better than I expected. I really didn't think that I'd make it through the first 1,000 miles without any kind of major issues with the engine, especially being my first experience with a HyperRace kit. So I've been very pleased with the TPR kit so far. I could blow it up tomorrow, we'll find out. In fact, subscribe and make sure you're there if I do. But with that said, if you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, please give it a like, and thank you for watching.